Welcome back, everyone, to the still ad-libbed titled Space Race Speedrun, a Kerbal space program series in which I attempt to speedrun every major crewed space program from history. And today is a special episode as it's the third and final installment of Phase 1 of this series, the first 3 manned American programs. So far, we've speedrun the Mercury program in a mere 3 launches using these rockets you can see before you, and then once we got that out of the way, we then smashed the Gemini program with just 3 launches again, using the 2 Titan II boosters and of course the Atlas Agena rocket. But now, it's time, ladies and gentlemen, for the big one, the one you've all been waiting for, Project Apollo. Now, for those unfamiliar with this series so far, what I'm going to attempt is end NASA's whole career, complete Project Apollo, and meet every major milestone it's set in as few launches as possible. Now, we'll begin where we began when we began running the beginnings of when NASA began their first manned program, Project Mercury. The first phase of Project Mercury was to test and validate the capsule's launch escape system, which of course is a vital component of the spacecraft in order to ensure our astronauts don't meet an explosive demise. And the Apollo program had a similar test platform to validate its launch escape system. Now, I know real rocket scientists and intellectuals would just use an entire Saturn V and spam the stage button after launch to test this, but apparently, in the real world, there's a thing called budgets and common sense. So I guess instead of that, we'll recreate the rocket that NASA used to test the Apollo launch escape system, the Little Joe 2, a small rocket comprised of 6 solid rocket engines that would launch a boilerplate or dummy capsule into the skies before the launch escape system would fire and, hopefully, pull the spacecraft to safety. Now, not only in this series am I trying to meet every milestone set by every major program, but I'm also trying to subtly one-up each milestone set by the program. And in this case, I am so confident in the technology of Lowne Aerospace that I don't think we need to have a dummy capsule on the Little Joe 2. I think we can have 3 of our astronauts sit in the command pod as we conduct this critical test to validate the capsule's safety. And here we are on the launch pad, and I've now switched to live commentary. So I don't know how this is going to go. I hope it's going to go okay, but let's see how we go. So Jebediah, Bill and Bob are ready in the capsule in 3, 2, 1. Let's go and test our launch escape system for the first time with crew on board. So really there's a lot at stake here. So the Little Joe 2 seems to be going okay. I'd say this is a pretty good rocket as far as airborne machines go, flying machines go, whatever, it doesn't matter. All we really need to do is get on a trajectory that will take us to land in the sea. I guess now would be a good time to deploy, so let's hit the abort action group in 3, 2, 1. Oof. Don't know about you, but I think that was an absolutely beautiful detachment from the lower stages there. So let's just detach that launch escape tower and deploy the parachutes. And is it gonna? It's cleared. It's fine. See, that's how well I designed this craft. And now we can just time warp down to splashdown. But I would say, all things considered, that's a pretty successful test of the launch escape system. And not only did we not use a pathetic boilerplate spacecraft, but we tested it with a crewed module, and all crew survived miraculously. Thank goodness. Our space program would have probably been shut down if they hadn't, but they did, so it's fine. And we can touch down in the water in 3, 2, 1. There it is. My live commentary leaves a bit to be desired, but I think I hit all the important points. Let's now move back to time-lapse Matt, and we can talk about our next launch. Now, for the next launch, I was a little bit undecided about which rocket to go with. I mean, obviously in Apollo, we want to use the Saturn V, and I've just shown you I wanted to use the Little Joe 2. But in the interim, there's 2 other rockets that featured quite prominently in the Apollo program, and that is the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B. Now, the difference between these 2 rockets is fairly minimal. There's not much difference between the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B, other than really the Saturn 1B being the upgrade over the Saturn I. I know there's a lot of nuanced differences that I could go into, but functionally and crucially aesthetically, there is very little difference between the 2 rockets. So I decided to just skip the Saturn I and move straight to the Saturn 1B, because after all, in this series, I'm trying to one-up NASA, and NASA, why did you go with the Saturn I? There's so many upgrades you could have gone with. as you demonstrated by building the Saturn 1B. So I'm just going to go straight to the Saturn 1B. We got it right the first time here at Lowne Aerospace Space Race Speedrun. Now, the Saturn 1B was probably the most intimidating rocket to try and recreate in Kerbal Space Program, and I'm not going to pretend that I've done a perfect recreation of the rocket, but I'd say I did a pretty good job. The reason I say it was a very intimidating rocket to design, it was certainly the most tricky to emulate out of the 3 Apollo rockets I'm creating in this video, is because the lower stage, or the first stage I should say, was actually made of lots of separate tanks. They were separate redstone tanks, I believe, and you get this, it's got a really unique look to it that's incidentally very difficult to recreate in Kerbal Space Program. So in the end, I kind of achieved the look by using the Mark 1 diameter fuel tanks to kind of create the general aesthetic of the Saturn 1B. And as for the actual payload of the Saturn 1B, I was a little bit torn about what to do because there were so many Saturn 1B launches that really I wasn't quite sure. But in the end, I decided to go with Apollo 5, which was the uncrewed orbital test of the lunar module, aka the lunar lander. Now, the lunar lander used for Apollo 5 was, it wasn't really the full thing. It didn't have landing legs, for example. It was a very stripped down article. It was a pure test of the basic systems of the vehicle. So I thought, let's one-up NASA again, and instead of just using like a half-finished lunar lander, I'll just use the lunar lander that I plan to take with us when we do our actual Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 recreation. So we've got to quickly cut away from the Saturn 1B build and quickly construct the lunar lander. And I kind of janked it together using the structural paneling pieces. I don't think it's a perfect shape, but then the actual lunar lander shape is quite difficult to replicate in Kerbal Space Program, at least in stock. There are some amazing mods, but I feel like this is a good enough approximation of the shape that we need. I'm going to paint all of these panels gold except 2 on the diagonals, because not all of the paneling on the lunar lander was gold, I think. I think a couple of panels were like painted black. Well, not painted black, but you know what I mean, coloured. They weren't coloured gold, basically. Looking at it now, it does look a bit... It does look a bit rough around the edges, but you know what? It's fine. No, and don't worry, I'm not actually going to add 8 landing legs to it. I'm just using 8 so I can use the symmetry of the octagon shape of the lander's body, and then we can just remove 4 of the legs from the symmetry and delete them as required. And with the landing legs added, that's pretty much the lander done. Fairly simple construct. I did consider recreating the Apollo moon rover and storing that on one of the corner parts of the lander, but I couldn't get it to fit. The actual Apollo rover wheels that come with the Making History DLC, they don't really fit into an appropriately sized lander, at least if you want to emulate the actual storage and deployment mode of the real Apollo rover. Like, you can make one fit, but it's a real tight squeeze, and I ended up coming up with a better solution, which I won't spoil for you, but I think you're gonna like it. Anyway, with the completion of the construction of the lunar lander, our build for the Saturn 1B, at least in its Apollo 5 configuration, is complete. So there it is on the launch pad, and I'd say it looks fairly close to the genuine article, and then we can blast off using our 8 engines. Now, I'm using the Vector engines because there's no, I don't think at least, that there is an in-game equivalent to the engines of the Saturn 1B. But what I have done is I've disabled the gimbal of the central 4 and only enabled the gimbal of the peripheral 4, because that was what the real Saturn 5... I said Saturn 5 again! That's what the real Saturn 1B did. It only had gimbal on the 4 outer engines. I mean, despite having gimbal, it also had 8 fins, so we should have a fairly stable rocket. Ironically, this rocket really wanted to list side to side on ascent, and speaking of the ascent, I'm going for a fairly steep profile, because while our thrust weight ratio at the first stage is excellent, the thrust weight ratio of the upper stage leaves a lot to be desired. So I wanted to try and build up as much altitude as possible using the first stage, so that we'd have loads of time to pick up the necessary horizontal speed to achieve orbit with our much slower upper stage. And I guess I could have made it faster by draining some of its fuel, because it has way too much delta V really for what it needs to have. But yeah, I don't know. It adds to the lift capability of my Saturn 1B, so it can be used for other missions. And I think there's probably something ironic in me using the space shuttle engines to power my replica of the Saturn 1B, given that the space shuttle pretty much replaced the Saturn 1B as NASA's workhorse vehicle. Obviously the Saturn V was their flagship, but Saturn 1B was their hauler that would put crew in space and do the mission. The space shuttle kind of replaced the Saturn 1B, so kind of a twisted act to power the Saturn 1B using its cause of death as its means of propulsion. And here I'm not being that faithful to the real mission. I'm actually deorbiting the lower stage so it doesn't get left stuck in orbit. But in doing so, we've kind of met an objective set by Apollo 4, which is to test the ability to relight the J2 engine after it had already been lit once. Now, admittedly, Apollo 4 was a Saturn V, not a Saturn 1B, but it's all irrelevant, really. I've proven that this engine can be relit, and I've proven that we can throttle and light the lander engine, and all the systems seem to work. The landing legs deploy, the ladder deploys, and we can EVA from the hatch. That's right! I have once again dabbed on NASA. And I've not only tested that the lander works, but I've also tested and validated the fact that it can sustain a Kerbal, and they can survive in space on board the lander, which of course does leave the question of how we're going to get Jebediah back to the surface of Kerbin. But it's Jebediah Kerman, all right. He's going to be fine. First of all, though, we do need to test the ascent engine there, which once again, it works beautifully, and we can throttle it, and it works really, really well. And now we need to get Jeb back home. So, obviously, the lunar lander doesn't have parachutes, because why would it? But what we can do is we can just have Jeb stay in the cabin to survive the worst of the re-entry heat, and then we can just bail him out, and we can use his personal parachute to get down to the surface. But during this part of the flight, we can test the lunar lander engine, and we can confirm that it does work when exposed to the extreme heat of re-entry, which is not something that we would need, but it's good to know. I started freaking out a bit there because I couldn't get Jebediah to EVA because I didn't realize that if you've got physics time warp on, you can't EVA. I don't know how it's taken me so long to realize that that's a thing, but there you go. I learned something in this mission. So really, this being a test flight of Apollo, it taught me something. So in a way, we can call that another success for my Saturn 1B replica. Come on, Jeb. Splashdown anytime today. There we go. Beautiful. And now that we have tested the launch escape system, we've tested the lunar lander, I think we're pretty much ready to build the rocket that you all came here for, the mighty Saturn V, so that we can actually perform a landing on the Mun. And here I am building it here. So the first thing I'm doing is building the little capsule and building a shroud for the launch escape system. The nose cone on top of the capsule isn't great. It's not as sleek as the real thing, but I wanted to have the 3 parachutes on top of the capsule on landing, like the real Apollo capsule. And when you try and put the parachutes inside that nose cone adapter, which I'm like 99% sure that adapter piece was designed to do, the parachutes won't deploy. Even if you remove the shroud, it's a glitch. It's a known glitch with that part. I don't know if Squad have fixed it. It's literally been 2 years since I've tested this, but I didn't want to take any chances. So the shroud there that the docking port is attached to is going to be empty, and the parachutes are just underneath it, and they're sort of separated by a decoupler. So that's kind of why the nose of the Apollo command module is a bit weird looking. And then it's time to build the rest of the rocket, not before I add fuel to the to the command module. That would be a very critical part of the rocket's design. I think we can all agree. Anyway, let's get to building the rest of the rockets. There's the 3rd stage there with its single J2 engine that's going to get us from low Kerbin orbit to the Mun. Then we're building the 2nd stage with its 5 J2 engines. There they all are there. And of course, got to build the massive 1st stage with its 5 F1 engines. And a few I's to dot, T's to cross, like adding batteries and fuel cells and stuff. But other than that, the rocket is done. I know it's not perfect. There's always going to be people that are just better at recreating things than me. But I think, for all intents and purposes, I'd say this is a pretty good approximation of the Saturn V. And here we are, ready to launch. 3, 2, 1. I feel like I had to just stop talking there to really bask in the might of that incredibly powerful 1st stage of the rocket there. We can start speeding up the footage a bit as we make our way to space. So the Saturn V in Kerbal Space Program is it's way too powerful for what it needs to do. In fact, the actual stock vessel that just comes with the game, the Saturn V in the stock doesn't have a 2nd stage. It's just 2 stages to orbit rather than 3, because it's very, very easy to get to Kerbin orbit, and it's very difficult by comparison to get to Earth orbit. So my Saturn V does a lot better with its stages than the real Saturn V. So we're actually very, very high up in the atmosphere when it comes to deploying the first stage, and then this second stage is pretty much just going to get us all the way to orbit. I'm not going to complete our orbit with this stage for the sake of accuracy, but we could quite easily, I think we could probably get all the way to the Mun using the Delta V in this stage if I didn't detach it early and waste all that fuel for the sake of realism. So there you are, NASA, again, you know, your Saturn V could only just get to the Mun, get to the Moon. Mine can probably go like to Eve or Venus, maybe. I don't know. I haven't crunched the numbers, but what I'm saying, NASA, is that like I'm just better at rocket science than you, and that's really the take home I want to really hammer into everyone right now, is that SpaceX needs to hire me. I would really like to be the guy that does all the talking on the Starlink launches and all the other launches, do some commentary. I think that'd be a pretty sweet gig. So SpaceX, if this does not prove that I am 100% fluent in the nuances of rocket science and rocket design, then quite frankly, I don't know what will. I always enjoy making comments like this, because then I can read the comment section and see all of the people who don't realize I'm being tongue-in-cheek right now. They get really angry in the comments. Just to be clear, guys, I am very well aware that Kerbal Space Program is not a one-to-one simulation of actual rocket science. Don't worry. But you know, SpaceX, I can do the whiskey tasting in the high bay bar. That would be a good job for me. Anyway, you might be wondering why my orbit is so high, and that's because the parking orbit in the real Apollo mission was 190 kilometers. So I decided to just do that because I had the Delta V. I know in terms of scaling, this is not the correct scale now. We are much higher above Kerbin compared to how high Apollo was above Earth, but you know, I just felt like I had to somehow justify my excess Delta V. Anyway, on to the next phase of the mission. I've already plotted the maneuver node, so it's too late for me to talk about plotting the maneuver node, but you can see I've kind of put myself on a free return trajectory. So at this point, if my engine was to fail, the spacecraft would just coast around the Mun, and then it would just return to Kerbin and re-enter, and everything would be fine. So I did a free return trajectory. Now it comes to plucking the lander from that Saturn V upper stage. So we are just going to grab onto it in 3, 2, 1. Beautiful docking. And then we can right-click the middle docking board. This is really weird staging. I probably should have just had it where the command module was directly attached to the top of the lander, rather than have both bits of the craft be attached to the third stage. But I just like making things complicated for myself, I guess. And speaking of making things complicated for myself, I put myself on a collision course, I think, to the Mun when I pulled the lunar lander away from the Saturn V upper stage. I ended up changing our orbit a bit too much, and I had to do a last-minute radial outburn in order to stop us from smashing into the lunar surface. And as speaking of the lunar surface, it is approaching us now, so we can perform our retrograde burn to get into our parking orbit. This is not going to be our final orbit. The real Apollo mission did one burn at where I just did a burn, but then it did a secondary burn at perigee to lower itself down to its final orbit, which we've now done. So there's not much else left to do other than transfer our 2 brave Kerbinauts into the lander can to perform Kerbal Kind's first ever landing on the surface of the Mun. So we've got Jebediah there piloting the vessel, and Bob Kerman, who is our scientist. He's going to grab some surface samples, do a bit of science stuff, whatever it is that scientists do, and a good time will be had by all. So just did a quick deorbit burn, time warped down to when I got close to the surface. Probably a little bit too late. It was a bit trigger happy with the time warp button there, so I did a quick radial outburn just to stop ourselves from smashing into the side of that crater, and then once we were clear, I then coasted down a little bit more conservatively. But now our surface velocity is pretty low, so we're now safe to perform our touchdown. I'm going to try and touch down below 5 meters per second, which, beautiful textbook landing, and there we are! Jebediah and Bob Kerman have landed on the surface of the Mun, and in doing so, we have met Apollo 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17's primary objective. And of course, we've one-upped NASA there because Apollo 13 didn't meet this objective. There was an explosion. You guys have all seen the film, right? And know of the historic, famous event of Apollo 13. We didn't have that problem, so it was fine. And there we are, we can plant our NASA flag. Now, I mentioned earlier that Apollo 15, 16, and 17 all brought rovers with them, which of course, we've not done. So people are going to be like, aha, Matt, you said you were trying to one-up NASA, but you have not, because NASA brought a car to the surface of the moon. But remember, I said earlier that I came up with a solution that I thought that you guys would like. And here it is. I sent a Lowne Aerospace big boy roving base to the surface of the moon to meet our brave Kerbonauts. I think this is probably a superior rover to the pathetic one that NASA sent. It was rubbish. It was like a folding rover. It didn't really have anything going for it. Like it didn't have a swimming pool in it, which this one does. This one's got a bar in it. It's got loads of space. It's got loads of cabins. It's got balconies. It's got loads of solar panels, radio equipment. There's a cinema inside it. There's even a little crazy golf course, 18 holes. Really good rover. So I think this is much better than NASA's. Bob Kerman is going to just take it for a quick joyride around the surface of the moon. And Jebediah can watch, I suppose. Now, my plan was to do a quick... I didn't want to spend too long on the rover segment because watching people drive rovers in Kerbal Space Program, at least for me, I don't find it the most entertaining. So I've sped the footage way up and we can just do a quick whip around to the edge of this crater and then we can return to Jebediah Kerman. However, at that point, ladies and gentlemen, things went a little bit Apollo 13. This mission was not completely without some failure, but hey, I'm just going to say that I'm recreating a failure. I've engineered in a mission failure to emulate Apollo 13. So this is actually part of the plan, but my plan was to ghost ride the whip past Jebediah Kerman, and then Bob could leap off the rover and jetpack down to the lander. But then he just sort of smacked his head on the top of that lab module and then was completely unresponsive. Like at this point, I was like smashing the keyboard, pressing every button, trying to get some sort of response from Bob, but it wasn't working. So I had to just then switch back to the rover and make it come to a stop, which is far more boring, but it was the only thing I could do if I wanted to save Bob. And I would quite like to bring my two Kerbonauts back to the surface of Kerbin to tell their tale to all. And here they go. So we got him free. It was fine. We could just jetpack him down to... I think he left his surface sample and EVA report inside the rover, come to think of it. But I guess he was scared. He was worried. Heat of the moment. These things happen. I'm sure at some point on Lowne Aerospace, we will return to the moon. I'm guessing. But anyway, time will tell. And right now, there are much more pressing matters at hand. For example, right now, we've got to get back to the orbiting command module. So the first thing I've done is shut down that lower Terrier engine. We can stage, and the craft will separate, and that spark engine will immediately fire. And the upper stage was incredibly easy to build because that cabin there that obviously is meant to be a replica of the Apollo lunar lander, it already has all the fuel, electrics, monopropellant, RCS thrusters. So the only thing I needed to add was a spark engine, and it worked really, really well. It has just shy of 1,000 meters per second of delta V, which is way more than enough that you need for the moon. So that is a pretty safe configuration if you're wanting to recreate an Apollo lander yourself, and maybe you play on console and can't download craft files from the description, which I don't even know I'm going to include a craft file because I don't think I've been including craft files in this series so far. I can't even remember now. I didn't even remember what I had for breakfast today, to be honest. So I don't know what I've been doing, but I've been talking about the build, and you guys have seen the build, so maybe I won't. I shouldn't be talking about this because I might just include one in the description. Wow, this is exciting. What's it going to be? You should look at the description and then you can write a comment and tell me, even though by then I will know for sure. Really, guys, I'm just stalling for time until we get to the docking itself, which I guess is well underway. So now I can just talk about that. I'm going to perform the docking with the command module, which is faithful to the real Apollo missions. I'm not going to do the, air quotes, Lowne lazy method of docking, in which we get both craft to contribute towards the docking. I'm just going to dock using the command module. I'm going to just leave the lander can as a dead weight, so we have to do all of the docking using the Apollo Command and Service module. And kind of tricky, we don't actually have that much monopropellant. I probably should have stuffed some extra monopropellant tanks into that service module, but I didn't. So we've only got the monopropellant that comes with the, I guess, the Apollo style. I really should learn the names of parts in Kerbal Space Program, given that, like, I play this game semi-professionally. I still just call it the Apollo style command pod. Is it the Mark III cargo? No, Mark III crew cabin? Is that what they call it? Crew cabin. That's how basic my I'm pretty sure the game calls all the crewed modules crew cabins, except the passenger ones, where it's a mixture of just hitchhiker storage or crew. Anyway, irrelevant, isn't it? Again, but look at that, we've docked through that mess of a commentary, so we can get Jebediah and Bob back into the Apollo command module, and then we can start plotting a course back home. Not before we detach the lunar lander, which of course will now be left to crash into the surface of the moon. It won't, it will stay in orbit forever, but in real life it crashed into the surface of the moon, and now we can plot a maneuver node to get back to Kerbin. The only thing really I was trying to focus on was making sure we land in the ocean, which really, there was no fancy calculations involved with this. I just went for any old periapsis in Kerbin's atmosphere and hoped for the best, and I lucked out. We landed in the ocean, just barely. So this counted as a splashdown, but there isn't really a secret method that I know of to guarantee you'll splash down in the ocean. It's just a case of going for it, making a quick save, and if it doesn't work, make a quick load. I really struggled to get an ocean landing in Gemini and Mercury, really ironically, in those videos. And I say ironically because I was only coming from low Kerbin orbit, but the first time I tried doing the Apollo landing, in which we came all the way from the moon, I got an ocean landing immediately. So I guess that's just life, isn't it? That's just life in a nutshell. What a deep topic. Speaking of deep, the ocean is deep, and we are landing in the... That was terrible. I'm not... You know what, guys? This has been a long video. It's like, I'm very tired. It's like 9:30 in the evening for me. My room is boiling hot because we've had a heat wave in the UK, and I've got no air conditioning, and I can't have my fan running because then you'll get picked up by the microphone. And really, it's just... I'm there. I've reached my limit. I'm just struggling on to get the video finished. But I guess, luckily, as luck would have it, the end is in sight. Literally, there is the water. We have splashed down, and thus we have absolutely smashed the Apollo program in a mere 3 launches. We validated the launch escape system with our Little Joe 2. We tested the lunar module using the Saturn V, and of course then we just did the entire moon landing. No dress rehearsals or anything like that. We just went ahead and did it because that's what we do here at Lowne Aerospace. We are the speedrun masters. NASA, hang your head in shame. Anyway, for the next episode, I'm going to rewind the clocks and look at the Soviet manned programs. I'll say no more than that at the moment. On screen, though, there are some names scrolling on the left. They're my Patreon supporters who really make all of this content possible. So big props to you guys. Thank you so much for donating. If you want to join their ranks, you can do so by clicking the Patreon card on screen. You can also help contribute to the channel by joining, which is there's a button that says join underneath the video. You get a little badge next to your name so you can show off to everyone, I guess. There's also a link on screen. There's more than one link on screen, actually. I don't know why I didn't use the plural of links. And wow, now I've run out of time.